Good morning, my name is Annette and I work within the marketing team at HR Assured. Thank you for taking some time out of your busy day to join our webinar, Rethinking WHS. For those of you who are not familiar with HR Assured, we're part of the FCB group. We help businesses navigate around Australia and New Zealand's complex employment laws by providing a range of services and products to ensure businesses are compliant. If you're not familiar with us, I'll just explain some of the benefits of partnering with HR Assured. You'll have access to our award-winning services, including our 24/7 telephone advisory service, comprehensive HR and WHS audits, HR and WHS audits and software, insurance and representation, work health and safety, and a library of legal resources. So today's webinar will be presented by our Senior Workplace Relations Consultant, Emily Fisher. Emily is an experienced Senior Workplace Relations Consultant and handles complex workplace issues. She has a special interest in providing clients with comprehensive advice and solutions to ensure they can promote a functioning and compliant workplace. Today, Emily will be focusing on WHS, which is a must for all businesses. Employers are obligated to have the right systems and processes in place to ensure a safe working environment, and Emily is going to show you how to do that. So let's make a start. I'm going to hand over to Emily. She'll be going through today's agenda here on the screen. Welcome, Emily.
Thanks, Annette. Look, hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here this morning. So today we're going to be going through really a lot of the kind of basics of workplace health and safety, responsibility within the businesses, and then we're also going to touch on a couple of examples that we've seen or that I've seen through my experience, and the kind of questions that we're getting through the telephone advisory service. But we will have some time for questions at the end. So if you do have any questions during the webinar that might pop up or you'd like me to expand on a couple of points, please put these into the actual Q&A function on Zoom. So we won't be going through the ones in the comments, but in the Q&A section, Annette will be having a look through the questions that you've put in there. And I'll be answering as many as I can at the end. Look for any current clients that the questions don't get answered if we run out of time. You can always give myself and the team a call through the telephone advisory service. And for people that have joined us that aren't clients right yet, clients, Annette will touch on how you can get in touch with us at the end. So look, in terms of WHS, when we think about WHS obligations, we need to understand the meaning of a duty of care. So a duty of care refers to the legal responsibility that you have as an employer to look after the safety and well-being of the people within your workplace. Workplace health and safety is governed at a state level, so there are workplace health and safety acts for each state and territory. But despite this, the requirements across the states tend to be very, very similar. There is sometimes this misconception that WHS practices doesn't necessarily apply to all businesses, but that's really not the case. So WHS applies to all businesses equally. Naturally, I do appreciate that there are some businesses that definitely have higher risk profiles in the safety sphere, but all businesses should really be doing their part to promote safety within the workplace. So in terms of responsibility, workplace health and safety responsibility, generally the acts, there are three categories of people who have specific duties for ensuring safety within the workplace. So these can be categorised as a person conducting a business or undertaking known as a PCBU, an officer, and a worker. So we need to ask that question, what is a PCBU? So a PCBU is a person or a duty holder, such as a company or a partnership that operates a business. So examples of PCBUs would be, companies, franchisees, the self-employed, contractors and subcontractors as well. They're generally not people who are employed solely as workers or volunteer associations that don't employ anyone. So put simply, a PCBU is anyone who operates a business. We then need to look at who are PCBUs responsible for. They are, and what are they responsible for? So they're responsible for the health and safety of workers, but this is not just employees. The Workplace Health and Safety Acts don't really rely on the existence of an employment relationship to define a worker, and I will be touching on this a little bit further. But it also extends to other people that might be affected by the business's activities. So this would be, businesses that have visitors or customers or members of the public that might enter their premises. So what are PCBUs also responsible for? So really it is ensuring the safety of workers, and the terminology used across the WHS Acts is so far as practicably and reasonably possible. So that includes all general duties for upholding safety within the work environments. So more generally, it can be broken down into a couple of steps. So the first one would really be consultation with your workers and consultation with other PCBUs about safety, about risks, and about hazards within the workplace, and the steps that you've got and that you can take to minimise those risks. The next one would be resolving workplace and health and safety issues. So if you have identified hazards and there is a risk because those hazards are present, what steps are you undertaking to resolve those issues? It can also be broken down into ensuring the health and safety of others. So resolving the WHS issues that you have will involve steps that you undertake to ensure the safety of your workers as defined, as well as those visitors, customers and that kind of thing that might come on your premises. PCBUs also need to comply with all the regulations that apply to their business at law. And there's also specific notification requirements for certain types of incidences, which I will talk about. So the second category that we talked about in terms of people that have responsibility for promoting and ensuring WHS is an officer. So officers are people in roles that have really high level of influence or high level of control over workers. So they could be someone like a business owner, maybe your kind of C-suite executive team. If you've got managers, they will have responsibilities. If you've got any kind of other senior employees, or even someone in HR. So these are really the people that drive compliance for workplace health and safety within your business and should be really like leading by example for all employees within the organisation. The primary responsibility of officers in the WHS space is to exercise what we call due diligence. So due diligence is really about safety leadership. It is taking those active steps to ensure that the company is compliant with all of its WHS obligations at law. And when we look at due diligence, it can really be broken down into 6 parts. So there's 6 parts on the screen today. So the first one is understanding your business's risks and identifying the hazards, maintaining adequate WHS procedures and protocols, continuing your knowledge and continuing to learn about workplace health and safety, receiving and considering information about hazards, risks and incidents, minimising the risk within the workplace, and monitoring an employee's capacity to work. The third kind of group that has responsibility for WHS was workers. So I said a worker isn't really only defined by the employment relationship. So a worker could be an employee, it could be a trainee, an apprentice, a work experience student, it could be a volunteer, a contractor or a subcontractor. It even extends to an employee of a subtractor or subcontractor that might be performing work on your premises. And it also extends to an employee of a labour hire company as well. So PCBUs owe duties to workers, but what are the duties that your workers and officers owe to you? So workers and officers are required to take reasonable care of their own health and safety within the workplace. They also need to take reasonable care that their conduct might not adversely affect others, so that they're not causing any risk to the health and safety of others within the workplace. They are also required to comply, so far as they're reasonably able to, with your instructions. So that would be with your policies, procedures, and processes that you have put in place to ensure safety within the workplace. On to the next one. Look, I used this term reasonably practical before about so how you have to ensure safety so far as reasonably practicable. And so we can look at what reasonably practicable takes into account. And so that would be the likelihood of the hazard or the risk occurring, the degree of harm or possible consequences should this hazard or this risk arise, the state of knowledge about a risk, the availability and suitability of ways for eliminating or minimising the hazard or the risk as well. So effectively, it's what the person in the PCBU knows and what they ought to have done to have known about the risk, but also undertaken processes to try and eliminate the risk. And if it can't be eliminated, it needs to be minimised. And the last thing and the final thing that really is taken into account once you've taken all those points and considered all those points would be the potential cost of eliminating those hazards or risks. So we've spoken a lot about the responsibilities of people to promote workplace health and safety and ensure that you're complying with all your obligations at law. But I think now we need to go into trying to understand what are you required to do. And we can go through that quickly. So how are you going to do all these things internally? Look, managing WHS is all about planning. Without adequate protocols, both you, your officers and your workers won't be able to effectively manage risks and prevent injuries from occurring. So I'm going to link these back to the responsibilities that PCBUs have. So the first one is consultation. You're required to consult with your workers who carry out work that might be affected by a particular WHS matter. And you also need to consult, cooperate and coordinate activities with other duty holders that share WHS responsibilities. So if you're operating in a business where you might have multiple contractors and subcontractors that are PCBUs in and of themselves that also have employees that you owe a duty to because they're considered workers as defined, you need to consult with not only your own staff but those people as well. There are particular times when you need to consult. So that would be when identifying any hazards that you have within the workplace, assessing the risks of those hazards, and then making the decisions on how to minimise the risk or eliminate the risk, which really is the desired outcome. You also need to consult when you're making decisions about the facilities or the workplace that will affect the welfare of your workers. If you're ever proposing any changes to workplace practices that might affect the safety of workers, you'll need to consult with them all on a case-by-case basis, really. And really any decision-making processes about procedures of resolving workplace health and safety need to be discussed with your staff members as well. The next point is issue resolution. So you need to make reasonable efforts to resolve workplace health and safety issues, but there might still be a risk present. We might not be able to have the desired effect of eliminating all the risks. So if you're needing to have issue resolution procedures, it's really important to have one in place. So follow an agreed procedure. If there isn't one in place, you might just need to look at or seek advice on, I've got a particular risk, I don't understand what my obligations in terms of the regulations are. So if you don't have a internal procedure in place, at least make sure that you're complying with all your WHS obligations. Look, set out an agreed procedure in writing and communicate it to all workers. Look, I'm not naive to the fact that you won't be able to eliminate every risk that you run into, but if there is a risk present, it is so important to have written processes and procedures in place that your officers and workers are aware of. And so they know how to respond to certain hazards, and they know how to minimize the risks. You may also decide to potentially call an inspector if a risk can't be resolved, because you've identified a hazard. You can't minimize the risk to the extent that it's safe for your workers to perform work. I talked a little bit before about incident notification. So there are certain things that are considered a notifiable incident that you would need to report to your relevant state regulatory body. So a notifiable incident is where someone dies, there is a serious injury or illness to a person, or there's also potentially a dangerous incident that occurs. So it's not a requirement that someone has been injured, and then that triggers the need to notify. If there is an incident at work that could have potentially caused harm to your staff, and even though thankfully it didn't, you're still required to notify the right regulatory body. So in terms of if a notifiable incident occurs, the first thing you need to do is notify work cover immediately. So as soon as you've become aware of it, you need to take all reasonable steps to ensure that the incident site is preserved until an inspector is able to come and have a look at the site, or if for whatever reason you're directed by an inspector to do otherwise, you can do something to the site. But there's record keeping obligations here. So you need to keep a record of a notifiable incident for five years after it occurs. So in terms of these processes and procedures, there are record keeping obligations and things that we should be doing. Where should these processes and procedures be stored? Where do we, once we've identified a hazard, where do we log it so that everyone knows that it's a hazard? So it's part of ensuring safety is not only just taking these steps, but making sure employees have access to everything to know how that they're meant to conduct themselves within the workplace. And that goes for all workers, not just employees. So what you might do to keep record of your workplace health and safety processes and management is to have a WHS management system. So this would include things like a hazard register, a risk register. It would include a library of all your incident management procedures or issue resolution procedures, your particular WHS policies, but also your consultation records. So I talked a little bit before about when we need to consult. We need to keep written evidence of what we talked about during that consultation process and who was present. Because if for whatever reason there was a group of workers or particular workers that weren't present at that consultation, we need to make sure that we've had follow-ups with them so they're aware of what was discussed. And look, for this reason, as I said before, we do recommend that you have an online workplace health and safety management system. So for existing clients that are on the webinar today, you do have that function through the HRA cloud. So our WHS management system has really all the documents and functions that you need to assist in complying with your obligations at law and promoting safety within the workplace. Look, onto the next one. I'm going to talk about an example of remote working environments. So I'm sure a lot of you can agree with me that March last year was a time that many organisations realised that there was a really serious gap in their WHS understanding, in their systems and processes. And this was when the government announced the working from home order. Now, here at HR Assured, we were inundated with requests for working from home policies, checklists, and other procedures. And callers were really needing to know what their obligations were to ensure the safety of their staff members when they were away from the work site and they were performing all their work from home. Now, whilst a number of our clients called through and they did have some employees already operating on a working from home arrangement, they had it on such a larger scale, and they really realised that there were these gaps in their systems to make sure that they had done their due diligence and that they were exercising their duty of care for all employees to be performing work safely from home. Now, look, I've got the classic setup for home on the screen. Now, this might be kind of second nature or common knowledge to people, but PCBUs needed to have documents in place and checklists to ensure that their staff did actually have a safe home setup. Because if an employee was injured while at home, because they didn't have the right setup, they didn't have anything, any checks and balances in place around what do we do with cords, they might not have the right setup for their desk, and they might have back injuries or something like that. The PCBUs needed to know for certain through some sort of document or safety measure that their employees had that right setup. So the documents that we saw were needed at that point in time were, look, your standard working from home policy was really important. But what we also developed was a working from home checklist. So it included all the list of things that an employee or a worker might need to have a look at in terms of their home setup to ensure that they were safe, and they could fill those out, send them back to their employer. And their employer was then sitting there, okay, I'm comfortable that my staff member has a safe working environment to perform work from home. And if for whatever reason they didn't, the employer then knew that they could go and take reasonable steps to give them that safe work environment. So they might be providing them with additional, office chairs, office desks, different computers, and that kind of thing. And the other thing that we also developed was a working from home application process. Now, that made it a little bit difficult when there was the working from home order last year, but it means that before someone is going to work from home, they can fill out an application process so that their employer won't effectively allow them to work from home unless they are satisfied that they have a safe working environment. Look, aside from systems and processes for working from home, there was another question that arose, or two questions that arose. And one of them was, to what extent does an employer have the responsibility to ensure safety for their employee while they're working from home? And when it comes to workers' compensation, what constitutes work performed in the course of employment? Now, a sad example of an answer to these two questions and why it's so important and where employer liabilities are is the case of workers' compensation nominal insurer and Hill. So in this case, it was the Court of Appeal of the Supreme Court of New South Wales confirmed that the death that occurred whilst working from home arose out of and in the course of the deceased's employment, and they ordered that the workers' compensation insurer pay death benefits to this worker's family. So it was in June 2010, the deceased de facto partner was suffering from some paranoid delusions, and while at home attacked her, and unfortunately she passed away. So the deceased children then claimed death benefits under the Workers' Compensation Act, and this was against the insurer, and argued that the death of their mother resulted from injuries that were sustained in the course of her employment because she was working from home. Now, naturally, the insurer denied liability and argued that the delusions of the deceased de facto's partner were not real and therefore could not possibly form part of the conditions of the deceased employment, and hence that there was no connection between employment and the injury sustained that was her death. So the matter was first heard by the Workers' Compensation Commission, and it was found that the deceased death did arise out of her employment, and the deceased's employment was a substantial contributing factor to her injuries that resulted in death. Now, the children were awarded a large sum, and the court in this case reiterated that the course of employment, it extends beyond workers' normal hours and place of work, and that a worker is doing something which is part of or incidental to their service, then this is considered to be within the course of employment. So it's a really timely reminder for all employers that do have working from home arrangements, that they need to do more than just ensure the safety and setup of your employees is safe, but also that the home environment itself is a safe place to work. The last little thing I'm going to touch on, I think it's very prevalent at the moment, is the priority for PCBUs to ensure that they've taken all reasonable steps to identify and eliminate risks of sexual harassment in the workplace. Now, look, WHS and sexual harassment, the first real step to trying to manage this in the workplace, outside of systems and processes and all this other kind of stuff, is really establishing your workplace culture and values. So your employees need to understand that when they come into the workplace, there is a certain standard that they are required to uphold, and that there is conduct that they can engage in within the workplace that is contrary to those values. So once this values framework has been established, you can then provide regular and ongoing training to your officers and to your workers on what is and isn't acceptable conduct. This not only includes the actual conduct itself, but it would be examples like when and how incidents might occur, and what steps someone can take to prevent sexual harassment, or if they think that they have identified an example of where it's occurred to themselves or to someone else within the workplace, what are they to do and who are they to report that to? So you'd be doing that through the implementation of policies and procedures to clarify the responsibilities of particular workers and officers and the processes that they need to follow to deal with sexual harassment. So how to report incidents is really, really important, an incident reporting process and even a grievance management process. And also what support services might be available to someone if, for whatever reason, they're experiencing sexual harassment in any form within the workplace. Look, in sexual harassment and WHS, being proactive rather than reactive is incredibly important. And look, it's really important because of what we call accessoral liability. So there's accessoral liability for PCBUs and officers. So you need to do everything so far as reasonably practicable to prevent WH risks from occurring. That's every WHS risk. If you don't have the systems and processes in place to prevent it from happening, and it does occur, PCBUs and officers may be held liable for the conduct of their employees if you haven't done that. So even if an employee is potentially acting outside of the scope of employment and engaging in behaviour that might be considered sexual harassment, if you don't have a policy in place, you don't have any procedures, there's no incident management policy, there's no grievance procedure, you haven't done everything so far as reasonably practicable to prevent a risk from happening in the workplace. So it's really important that we're not just talking about hazards and risks in their physical form, excuse me, that employees might suffer physical injury. It's also that kind of emotional strain and emotional stress that can arise from this kind of conduct within the workplace. Now, look, in terms of content, I know I've given everyone a lot of information over the last half hour. I'm sure there'll be a number of questions that have come through, and I think Annette's going to kindly go through some of those now.
I will. We've got a few questions for you, Emily.
Sure.
Okay, so let's go for the first one. What is the difference between a hazard and a risk?
Sure. Look, okay, so a hazard is a situation or a thing that might cause harm to a person. So it might be that a physical thing, they might trip, they might fall. So that's the actual hazard itself. It's that thing, or it's that situation that has the potential to cause harm. A risk is slightly different. When we look at risk, we look at the possibility of harm. So the process that we really undertake is we've identified a hazard, and then what is the possibility of risks? That might be low, medium, high. And then when you're looking at trying to minimize or eliminate that risk, if you've identified a hazard and the risk of injury is high, what steps can we take to take it down? So if we can't eliminate it, it might be high risk, then it goes to kind of, it's like very likely to occur, likely, unlikely, all that kind of thing. So we take it back down.
Great, thanks for that, Emily. We have a question going back to the case that you mentioned earlier.
Yep.
How can you foresee as an employer that the deceased employee's de facto is violent?
Look, I think there are a number of steps that you can take. Obviously, we can't do everything to try to minimize the risk, but there've been a couple of cases outside of this as well. But in terms of, I talked before about a checklist, and when you consult with your workers about whether working from home is safe for them, one of the things that we also need to ask is, okay, look, you'll be working from home and you'll be in this setup, but is there anyone else that will be working, that will be in the house while you're there? And you can ask them, is there anything else besides just the physical setup of your work that might cause potential risk to the health and safety? Obviously, if an employee isn't disclosing things, I appreciate that can be really difficult. But if you haven't asked those questions, you haven't really done your due diligence to ensure safety of your staff members. Look, I'm not naive to the fact that we can't totally prevent these things from happening always, but there are definitely additional steps that you can take to talk about other people that are within your working environment, like you would if you were in an office. You look at one particular staff member, you look at the other workers and the other people within there, and if there were any safety risks there, you would try and minimize them. And the same extends to when someone is working from home.
Great, thanks for that. This question here, can you provide some more information on the importance of addressing psychosocial hazards in the workplace?
Yeah, absolutely. So, if we pull it out of, I guess, the context of sexual harassment, those kind of psychosocial, I think, injuries will often occur from things like bullying or harassment. And that can be in the forms of simple employee to employee interactions, but it can also be potentially from management. So managers can take what we call reasonable management action in a reasonable way. And so when they're not doing so, and they might be being a bit too harsh on the employee and it's not considered reasonable management action, that's often where we see these psychological injuries occurring. And again, it comes down to the kind of like what I talked about with sexual harassment. Do you have a good workplace culture and good workplace values? Do your employees understand what is and is not acceptable within the workplace in terms of their conduct? If you have a really, really good place to work, you would hope that there wouldn't be any psychological injuries being incurred by your staff members during the course of their employment. That also goes to potential training on bullying and harassment, and training on conduct, and training your managers on management skills. Are they managing their people in a reasonable way? And is it kind of productive to their development and to their learning as well?
Thanks for that.
Can I add, Annette, before we move on to the next question, one other thing that's really important, which I haven't touched on here, is things like some businesses do, some businesses don't have it, but an employee access plan, or EAP as we like to call it, or employee access provider. So it means it's a company paid service where employees can call and speak to a counsellor, and they can talk through these issues as well. So if an employee is being performance managed, if you're undertaking a disciplinary process, if they've raised a grievance or they feel like they're being bullied within the workplace, you obviously have processes that you manage to deal with within the workplace, but then you say, look, also you have access to a free provider. You can have, however many calls you want with this counsellor. It is completely confidential. Effectively, the company just gets a bill at the end, so they just know someone that's using it. So that's one other really important thing for employees to have access to. And that's not only managing issues within the workplace like bullying and harassment, but work can be a really stressful place. You might just need to go and seek some counselling to manage the stress that you're incurring from your workload and that kind of thing.
Absolutely important. Thanks for adding that on. There's a question here about state-based obligations.
Yep.
So is a company that is based in one state obliged to have a HSR to represent one of their workers who work for the company in another state? Or do they have to prove that in each state, or can the company have one that covers workers in every state? Sorry, that was a mouthful.
Yeah, sure, that's all right. Look, you could have one that covers in every state. Just because I'm in Sydney, I'm in New South Wales, and I might be a workplace health and safety manager for a company that's nationwide. We don't necessarily have to have someone in that state. It all comes down to your due diligence and can you do everything so far as reasonably and practicably possible. Now, if you are a human resource manager or a workplace health and safety manager and you do have people across the entire country or in multiple states, it's really important that you're aware of the potential differences, though they are pretty minimal, the differences across the different state-based legislation, but you're aware of the potential differences so that you might need to change your systems and processes between each state. But no, you don't have to. But it goes to the same kind of conversation that we had about remote working environments. You might have people working in an office from Sydney and working from home from Sydney, and you've got someone working from home from Brisbane. The same kind of I guess duties will extend to that person up there.
Great. I think we've got time for a couple more.
Sure.
Emily. What support documents, etc., does HR should have online regarding sexual harassment?
Sure.
Do you have a template training program, and that can be rolled out to employees?
So we have I think it's broken down. I think we've got one really big policy that deals with equal employment opportunity, bullying and harassment, and sexual harassment. So that's kind of like the baseline. Like if you've got the policy, that's really good. It's not enough to just give it to an employee and say, sign it here, my due diligence is done. That's not how it works. So we need to make sure that if you've got that policy in place, employees are reading it, understanding it, they're signing it, and they're agreeing that they've read it. But having discussions with your staff members, practically in the workplace about what those things are is really important too. The other kind of things that we have on the HRA cloud, I can't remember the exact names off the top of my head, but it would be things like, record of a consultation that's taking place. So if you have that consultation, you can take record of that as well. But one of the really key things that you have in addition to the HRA cloud is access to the HR advisory service through us as well. Because look, we know that all businesses are different, and the kind of standard documents that we have on the HRA cloud might need development for those particular trainings that you're trying to do, like sexual harassment, so they can be changed. But yeah, look, really, we've got systems and processes and procedures for sexual harassment as well. We might have, I can't remember the exact name, but it's a procedure that we use to about escalation. So if we identify a risk, who do we escalate this to try and manage it? So that would be another really key one, and I talked about that during the sexual harassment part.
Amazing, thank you. Okay, what examples of harassment behaviours are you seeing in the course of the virtual world, and how can you minimise or action or prevent them?
Question. Really good one in the virtual world. Well, look, because sexual harassment, there's this common misconception that it involves touching and that kind of thing, but it also involves sexual jokes, sexual questions, all that kind of thing. So I can't give a specific example, but those kinds of things, those questions, those jokes, that hasn't really gone away now that we've moved to distance work. It's definitely all there in the virtual world. And we often see things come through about people that have made inappropriate sexual jokes just generally, or about other staff members on group chats, group emails, all that kind of thing. So it's that comments that make people feel uncomfortable that are of a sexual nature is the kind of thing that we see. And with sexual harassment, it can often be about perception as well. I might put something in a group chat or say something to someone that I don't think is offensive and I don't think constitutes sexual harassment. But the person I've said it to or sent it to might perceive it to be that way. So we do need to think when you're doing training with your staff and from a management perspective, am I saying something that might be perceived by someone in a particular way? If there's a risk of that happening, then it's probably not the right thing to be saying.
Thanks for that, Emily. There's loads of questions here and I feel like we can't get to all of them. So I think what we'll do is we'll reach out to everyone who we haven't answered and we'll try and help you offline if that's okay. So I think, yeah, we'll just have to wrap it up there with the questions. But before we go, I just want to offer anyone who's not an HR Assured client already the opportunity to try our advice line for free. If you do need some workplace advice, we can assist you and someone in our team will be in touch with you after the webinar to arrange this. And for our existing HR Assured clients, thank you so much for your support. And as you already know, you already have access to the telephone advisory service. So if you do need to seek advice, make sure you call us at any time. And we can help you. And look, there will be an email coming from Emily. She's going to send you some things, some gifts, all free. There'll be a fact sheet that outlines a lot of the things that were spoken about today. We'll give you some templates. There'll be a working from home template and a checklist, and we'll also give you access to that call. And of course, the recording from today has been, will be shared also in the email. So thank you so much, Emily, for your presentation. And I hope everybody, thank you so much. I hope everybody found it useful and we do hope to see you at our next webinar. So have a great day, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.